Hello everyone, and welcome back to Red Pen. Today I want to talk about two things that are sort of related but also quite separate. Number one, the candidacy for the President of the US of Cornel West. And then number two, the Trotskyist anti-war position. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, so starting off here, Cornel West recently just announced yet again that he will be changing parties. He's now dropping from the Green Party and running as president as on the independent ticket. Now, I think that a lot of socialists, a lot of progressives have very quickly become disillusioned with the Cornel West campaign. And that's why right now I do feel that it's appropriate to sort of present these critiques that I've sort of had in the back of my mind, and many others have as well, given the current situation. So if you're at all familiar with this channel, you'll know that when Cornel West originally announced his candidacy for the president of the US, it was very exciting news. Cornel West is an academic, and a lot of folks, whether you're coming into politics from a socialist position, from a Christian perspective, from an academic perspective, from the perspective of the poor, of the marginalized, even the Black liberation tradition, Cornel West's philosophy really does a good job of encompassing a broad set of, intersectionalities, you might say, a broad set of concerns in his pursuit of justice. And so it was very exciting news when Cornel West first announced that he was running for the presidency. He originally announced that he was running for the People's Party. And a lot of folks kind of pointed out that this was a little bit strange. This was a party that was sort of had its reputation tarnished through various scandals. And from what I understand, Chris Hedges, who's a personal friend of Cornel West, encouraged him to join the Green Party because it has greater access to the ballot. It has a stronger sort of organizational infrastructure, and it would just give him better exposure as well as a better sort of platform to run on in comparison to the People's Party. Well, the Green Party, there are some different theories going on out there as to why Cornel West made this recent shift. And I think the most convincing argument is that Cornel West is afraid of really posing a challenge to the Democrats. Now, I don't want to jump ahead too much here, but we'll return to that point about Cornel West, being afraid of the Democrats. But first, I just want to point out that I made a video here when Cornel West just announced his presidency. And it was sort of highlighting what I had said, just how he comes from this very rich tradition of social justice that, here he is on Occupy Wall Street. He's part of the church community. He's part of the academic community. He's been arrested by police officers several times. Here he is again at another Occupy Wall Street protest. Here he is, getting into a little bit of a conflict with the police. And he was one of the few to show up at the Charlottesville, the 2017 Unite the Right rally, where Cornel West shows up with this small group of activists to confront head-on this fascist threat that ended up murdering someone. Heather Heyer was murdered by these fascists that Cornel West was standing up against. And so he does have this history behind him, and he has committed himself to the struggle for social justice his whole life. The problem for him was translating this into politics. His vocabulary is very alien to not just a lot of people, but politics specifically. Referring to your political opponents as your brother, it has a sort of nice undertone to it, but it's not very. It goes against institutional norms, you might say. And so Cornel West really didn't seem to fit the mold in a lot of the ways that he talked about what he was going to do as president, right? It almost seems like he didn't really take this all that seriously. Not only is he flip-flopping between these different parties, but when you ask him about, basic questions about foreign policy, like how to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, he doesn't really have much of an outline as to how to make this happen. He's not exactly the biggest proponent of China, for example. So he's not exactly saying the Chinese peace deal is the way forward. This is what we should do. And instead, you get this sort of lofty idealism around, cosmopolitan brotherhood and whatnot. And so there's this sort of disconnect between the sort of academic, abstract idealism, you might say, that Christian socialism is characterized by, and the very sort of realpolitik of engaging in the world of international relations. And so there was a real strong disconnect there, which I think is obvious to anybody who's been observing this campaign for the past few months, because there's been a lot of mistakes, tactical mistakes, organizational mistakes, not only with the flip-flopping between parties, but for example, hiring Peter Dow as his campaign manager. Peter Dow was a campaign manager for the Democratic Party for his whole career. He not only ran in support of Hillary Clinton during her run for the presidency against Donald Trump, but he was one of the most vocal critics of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was a progressive campaign that Cornel West is modeling his own campaign after in various ways. And Peter Dow, when he was campaigning for Hillary Clinton, was one of the strongest proponents or loudest speakers that was amplifying this idea that if you didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, you were anti-woman, you were anti-feminist, and he actually was one of the ones that manufactured this idea of Bernie bros, that, it's only these out of touch, supposedly, perhaps misogynistic bros that are voting for Bernie Sanders because they don't understand what a great moment this is. And this is something that he defends himself on. He says, I just thought it was so important that we had a woman running for president. This is the kind of unprincipled crap that the progressive movement, the socialist movement, needs to avoid, is this kind of identity politics nonsense that says that, even though Hillary Clinton is a criminal war hawk that, was playing an instrumental role in the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, that was a proponent of every war that she's ever seen. Ignore all that, because she's a woman, and the first woman president is more important than fighting against imperialism. And so it's just wild that Cornel West decided to put this person in charge of his campaign as his lead manager, because he doesn't have a progressive history at all. He presents himself as somebody that all of a sudden Cornel West ran for the ticket, and I had this moment of reflection, and I realized the error of my past mistakes, and now I want to work towards bettering, etc. Nonsense. Because, why would you put somebody with that kind of track record into this position? He doesn't really have the strongest record. And so a lot of people that were supporting Cornel West, myself included, I mean, I'm Canadian, so there's a limit to what I'm able to do to support Cornel West. But people that were supporting Cornel West were very excited about his campaign. And then he switched parties. And then he hired Peter Dow. And then another big thing that really turned a lot of people off from Cornel West was his debate that he had with Jimmy Dore. Because Cornel West takes what might have been a sort of reasonable position prior to the Ukraine war, which is that Trump is a neo-fascist. He is a larger threat than the milquetoast neoliberals like Biden, as he puts it. And therefore, in order to combat fascism, we should vote for Biden. Now, again, this is something that, principled socialists would not agree with. But you could, make this argument and appeal to a broad sort of liberal socialist or liberal democratic voter base by saying, look, Trump is a neo-fascist. Look at all the terrible things that he's done. But, Biden isn't a socialist or a progressive. but he's not a fascist, right? That sort of rhetoric might have held weight prior to the war in Ukraine. But as Jimmy Dore points out in their discussion, is that you want to talk about this milquetoast neoliberal Biden being a lesser threat than the fascist Trump when he's literally pushing the entire country and the Western world into World War III with Russia through Ukraine. It's absolutely stunning to see how much of the progressive movement, including Cornel West, I mean, this is tragic. This is really, I'm not sitting here taking, pleasure in the fact that Cornel West has made all these mistakes and I'm going to make a YouTube video about it. This is a tragedy, and we need to be able to reflect on it soberly in order to move forward from this, the next time around, whenever that might be, and correct these terrible errors. Because it doesn't make sense right now to talk about milquetoast neoliberal Biden, who's literally funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine, against Trump, who's supposedly the worst, an even worse form of fascism. And so really there's a disconnect here that this type of approach might have made sense to some people prior to the Ukraine war, but it really doesn't make sense to take this position in the current context of the Ukraine war. And so what you have is Cornel West. There was one theory going around that said that Cornel West was afraid of the Democrats because of this position that he has. He didn't want the Democrats to lose to Trump, and he figured that by running on the Green Party ticket, he might actually get the votes that take away the possibility of success or victory for the Democratic Party. And so when he was in the People's Party, he was convinced to move into the Green Party because it would give him more exposure. He would get more votes. He would have a broader voter base. But now, he's kind of like taking this position that, no, we need the Democrats to win because we need to defeat Trump. And he's posing Trump as being like the worst thing in the world right now when we're in the middle of an armed conflict between two major global powers that are armed with nuclear weapons. I mean, the Republicans and the Democrats, have a lot of people that support this war on both sides. So to take one side over the other does nothing for this primary issue. Fascism under Trump is a real threat. The current war in Ukraine between two nuclear nations is also a major threat. And we can't say that, we need Biden to win in order to defeat Trump. That makes no sense anymore. And a lot of people that were engaged in this debate between Cornel West and Jimmy Dore have noticed that. Jimmy Dore didn't exactly go about this whole thing in the most comradely way, you might say. He was actually, kind of cringe about the whole thing, to be honest. However, Jimmy Dore does have the principled position here. It's that if you want to be an anti-war candidate, you have to be against the war, whether the Democrats or the Republicans are waging it. And unfortunately, it looks like Cornel West has compromised on this principled position in the name of some sort of tactical strategy to allow the Democrats to win. I hope that's not true, but it certainly, the evidence seems to be bearing that out. And so within the context of all of this, you've got Cornel West and much of the squad, as they're referred to, sort of taking a non-position on the war in Ukraine. Even when in Canadian Parliament, when all the parliamentarians stood up and clapped for the Nazi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, was asked what she thought of this. And her response was sort of nonchalant. She's like, yeah, that shouldn't happen. Like, she didn't outright condemn it. She didn't come out and, say that, draw these parallels between the World War II Nazi in Parliament that day and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine fighting for the Azov Battalion, which the Canadian government and the US government, which AOC is a part of, are funding. And so she's just not drawing those connections. She sort of minimized the question, minimized the whole situation. And so she's not taking a very serious position on the war. not taking a very serious position, pushing against this rhetoric that is sort of heating up, this sort of warmongering rhetoric towards China. And instead, what we have, in the U.S., shamefully, is the far right fascists like Matt Gaetz, who are becoming the anti-war voice of the U.S. government, within the U.S. government. And so let's just take a quick look at what Matt Gaetz says here on sort of leading the charge on getting rid of the current Republican Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy.
So we represent the pool, all the networks. Your message on this motion to vacate vote coming up at 2?
All I would add is that clearly somebody's been lied to, because we heard the president come out and say there was a deal with the speaker on Ukraine, and the speaker just stood up in front of all of us and said that there's no deal on Ukraine. The House Democrats say there's a deal on Ukraine, so we're going to have to sort that out. We're going to have to sort out who's lying, because somebody's lying about whether or not, as in this CR negotiation, there was a secret side deal on Ukraine funding. We'll see.
Do you think this motion will succeed?
Okay, so there you have it. Like Matt Gaetz, who was recently accused for child sex trafficking, is the voice of reason here when it comes to the war in Ukraine. That's the sad situation that we find ourselves in. Matt Gaetz, to his credit, handled this overthrow of the Speaker of the House, with perfection, and has also been consistently pushing for ending funding to Ukraine. Not because he has some sort of, again, principled position on the war or anything like that, but because he's just simply tapping into the everyday sentiment that is growing in America among the working class, among everyday average Americans and Canadians in this country, that we don't want our tax dollars going into funding this war any longer. Not only have 80,000 Ukrainians been slaughtered in the process of losing this war, the average fighting age of Ukrainian soldiers today is 40. Why? Because all of the younger soldiers have either been killed, they've been maimed, they've been traumatized, and they are no longer fighting condition. And so not only that, not only do we have a terrible tragedy with the amount of people that have died in this war, but furthermore, we have all of this money going to this war as if it couldn't be spent elsewhere. Someone recently pointed out to me that Canada has currently spent as much money on this war in Ukraine, $8 to $9 billion, which is the equivalent to what it would cost to build a high-speed railway across the country, or at least across a section of the country, which people in Canada are dying for. People in Canada talk about the necessity, talk about the pain that it is to travel across the country to visit their friends and family, because it's such a huge country and the population is so sparse, so sparsely spread out. And so a high-speed rail would connect the entire country together, which so many Canadians desire. But instead of taking the money that it would require to build that sort of infrastructure here at home to help Canadians, we send it to Ukraine to fuel this war so that more people can die. All for what? For what? Like, what's the end goal here? It really is shocking. And it's shocking that the hard right are the ones that are the anti-war voice here, right? Where's the squad? Where are the progressive Democrats? Even Cornel West, right? Like his take on the Ukraine war is just like, a trot position, which is basically that both sides are bad. I'm going to clean my hands of reality and just live up here in my head where both sides are bad and peace lives, up here. Rather than trying to work out the dirty details of reality to bring real peace between two real warring countries, or NATO and Russia. And so, still bizarre. But yeah. Okay, let's pivot quickly over to I want to say a few things about the UAW and Jacobin. So the UAW strike appears to be going somewhat smoothly. The strategy of the stand-up strike makes a little bit more sense once you get into sort of the details and the rationale for why they chose a stand-up rather than sit-down strike. But, I just want to relate what I was just saying about capitulating to the Democratic Party as the lesser of two evils, as a practice that, it seems to be what Cornel West is taking up. But really, we have this sort of whole faction of the left that, is kind of tied up with Jacobin magazine. And so here you have Jacobin magazine. I can't find the article for this on its website, but you can find this this take here on its Instagram page. It says, Joe Biden's trip to the UAW picket lines shows why you push Democrats, not capitulate to them. Now, I understand that the UAW is a union, and there's a sort of limited revolutionary potential that unions can realize. Most of what unions are fighting for is the UAW is fighting for is auto worker rights and wages, collective bargaining rights, etc. It's a conflict between the union and the employer. And so there might be a tactic within the UAW of capitulating or pushing the Democrats, as Jacobin magazine argues here. But in doing that, it exposes the limitations, the revolutionary limitations of unionism, right? But Jacobin magazine, that's one thing for the UAW to have that approach, but it's another for Jacobin magazine to be saying Joe Biden's trip to the UAW picket lines shows why you push Democrats, not capitulate to them. So yeah, you don't surrender to the Democrats, but like pushing them, like as if there's this sort of idea that the Democrats are still like the left, and if we just nudge them a little harder, they'll become more left. And nothing could be further from the truth. It really is sad to see Jacobin magazine, right, which names itself after the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins, and whose logo is Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary, say things like this. The idea that Maximilien Robespierre or Toussaint Louverture would have been advocating for pushing the Democrats towards the left in our time is laughable. And again, it's sad. It's sad that Jacobin magazine has become this sort of mouthpiece for the progressive movement that, doesn't pull people away from the Democrats into socialism, but tries to marry the two by bringing socialists into the Democratic Party. Again, it's like we learned nothing from the Bernie Sanders campaign. Jacobin. The other sort of broad tendency on the left that we need to be addressing a little bit more clearly in our anti-war positions, socialists and communists, in taking an anti-war position, is to be able to say that we don't love Vladimir Putin. We don't love Muammar Gaddafi. We don't love Bashar al-Assad. But we don't think that these people should have their governments overthrown and be assassinated by U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism is the number one enemy. And to not recognize that is to fall into these sort of Trotskyist positions that, again, are characterized by a sort of regress into their heads, like this idealism of we're not going to support either side because both sides are bad. And so this article here is good, a really pointed example of that, because I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what you basically find is, yes, Fight Back, this Trotskyist organization, is very critical of the standing ovation that was given in Canada's Parliament for the World War II era Nazi. However, in their analysis, they can only be critical of both sides. The Trots, they never pick a side. They have no courage in saying, we don't agree with Putin, we don't agree with Bashar al-Assad, we don't agree with Muammar Gaddafi, but we will stand on their side against U.S. imperialism because that is the number one enemy. They don't do that. Instead, what they'll do is they'll critique U.S. imperialism without ever mentioning that it's going to be siding with Russia. And so you have this scathing critique of everything going on in Canada's parliament, and absolutely no mention of the legitimacy of Russia's claim that Canada does not take denazification in Ukraine seriously. The article even fails to point out the simple fact that Canada was not only standing and clapping for a Nazi, but Canada was standing and clapping for a Nazi that fought against the Russians, which Canada was allied with. Now, again, who knows with Trots, right? Because everything is Stalin's fault. Maybe they didn't want to mention the fact that Canada was aligned with the Russians during World War II, because that would have undermined their whole argument here. And so again, I'm not sure exactly what's going on in the Trotskyist sort of approach to the anti-war movement. As far as I can tell, they want to wash their hands clean of, not siding with either side, right? If you don't take a side on either side, you can remain pure. You can remain pure and constantly critical of everything going on around you, and you will always be right. You can be perfect if you never take a position, and the Trotskyists are wonderful. They're experts at that, and they're not only experts at that when it comes to Russia, but also China, because again, they're critical of imperialism, but they're also critical of those that are victims of imperialism, because they call them sub-imperialists, right? The Trotsky phase that says that, even these non-imperialist countries like China, that China's imperialist, they claim that those are just sub-imperialist countries that we should also fight against. We have to fight against both. And the thing is that they say we have to fight against both by supporting the workers in our own country. Yes, I agree. We should support the workers in our own country. Every communist agrees with that. But at the end of the day, reality requires us to take action. And to take action, you need to situate yourself in reality, which means taking a side, right? Again, you don't have to, be an advocate for Bashar al-Assad or Gaddafi or Putin all the way home. But you do have to side with them insofar as you recognize that they are fighting against a larger enemy, which is U.S. imperialism. And that just doesn't seem to be appreciated. So instead, what you get in this publication, In Defense of Marxism, which is another Trotskyist publication, is, China bashing. China, the crisis facing the youth today and the struggle for the future. This was written in September 2023. Okay, this is a new article. It's only October 6th right now. And so there was this person, this trot, that wrote an article on how there's a crisis facing the youth in China today, and they're struggling for the future. And again, I'm not going to go through this whole article, but there's this idea that, again, the Trotskyist position is that every working class needs to fight its own struggle at home. And so that's why it's focusing on, the youth. They're going to be struggling for the future against the Communist Party of China, because Trotskyists don't think that the Communist Party of China is really communist. They side with the U.S. They don't actually side with the U.S. State Department on that, because the U.S. State Department actually recognizes that the Communist Party of China is actually communist and is implementing socialism. The Trots are kind of all on their own there in terms of characterizing China as imperialist. Which is quite bizarre. But anyways, they point out that recent figures have shown youth unemployment in China now stands at over 20%, double its pre-pandemic level. Well, again, I'm not going to get entirely into this article because most of it's nonsense anyway. But there are certain sort of measurements or indicators that we read through our own cultural lens when it comes to China. Because in our society, if there was a youth unemployment crisis of youth unemployment rising over 20%, that would be an emergency. That would be a strong indicator that the youth are not integrating well into our society. However, in a country like China, where youth, a huge portion of the youth go to school, they get university degrees. I believe that China right now is the largest, has the largest number per capita graduates in the STEM field. However, in a country like China, when we read that there is a 20% youth unemployment, again, we might read that through our own cultural lens as being a problem. But in China, that means that lots of when students go to school in China, they don't have to get a job. Tuition, I think, is free. It's at least affordable enough that youth, generally speaking, don't have to work a job while they're going to university, which, in Canada and the US is almost unheard of. But that's a good chunk of why China has this large youth unemployment crisis, is because a large portion of China's youth don't need to work when they're in schools. It's actually a good thing that they are not employed. It gives them more time to study, something that I wish that we had in this country. But again, you'll have these anti-communist, anti-Chinese publications like the Trotskyist in Defense of Marxism coming out and having absolutely no nuance when it comes to this perspective. And again, like the whole article is just nonsense, talking about like the authoritarianism of the COVID-19 lockdowns, when like China had the most successful, if you look at the number of people that got sick or died in China, the largest country in the world, compared to everywhere else, to say that their COVID-19 lockdown measures were not a success in terms of the public health strategy is laughable. Obviously, there are side effects and consequences, unintended consequences that come along with that, like depression, like loneliness and whatnot, and those are real concerns. But to say that the youth in China are facing a crisis because of this is a far stretch, and here's a little bit more evidence as to why. The BBC, by no means a communist or socialist publication, but the state-funded news outlet of the UK, points out that there's a country where 70% of millennials are homeowners. Wow, that's a high number of millennials that are homeowners. Oh, turns out that it's in China. If you're aged 19 to 36 and don't own your own home, you're probably not reading this in China. Yeah, you're right, because while 70% of Chinese millennials own their own home, which the BBC actually points out the BBC argues is for bad reasons, but 70% of Chinese millennials own their own home, while in the US, for example, 35% of millennials own their own home. In Canada, I think it's closer to about 50%, but it's still not as high as China. And in fact, rent right now in Canada is skyrocketing. We are facing a housing crisis. And in fact, people are forecasting a large default on mortgages if interest rates continue to climb. And there's going to be a massive unemployment crisis in this country. A mortgage crisis in this country where people are going to be defaulting on their loans if interest rates continue to rise. That is not a problem in China. China has certain problems with its deficits, with its debt, but it's mostly state-funded debt. Like China's in debt to itself. The municipal governments or the provincial governments are in debt to the national government. Different levels of government are in debt to each other. Whereas in Canada and the US, we're not in debt to ourselves. We're in debt to China. We borrow our money from China and use it to who knows what we do. Give it to Ukraine, I guess. I don't know. But it is interesting to note that, while China has this 70% millennial home ownership, you get these Trotskyist publications talking about the crisis of youth unemployment and like the future looks bleak for the youth in China. The future doesn't look brighter for any youth anywhere across the world than it does in China. China is the fastest growing economy in the world. The BBC has a tendency to also publish articles that talk about how China's economy is on the verge of collapse, which is so laughable because not only is the Chinese economy doing absolutely remarkably, it is the fastest growing economy in world history, but the British economy is collapsing. Britain is throwing rocks in a glass house when it says that China's economy is not doing so well. Britain's economy is doing so poorly that you have the Conservative government starting to float the notion of maybe not sending so much money to Ukraine. Rishi Sunak talking about how it's maybe not a good idea when we have so many Brits at home that are dealing with, serious problems that require, state spending. Not that the Conservatives are ever going to do that, but at least that's the argument. Same argument that, U.S. Congressmen like Matt Gaetz, Republicans, fascist Republicans, are making in the U.S., right? We got our own problems at home. Why are we sending all this money to Ukraine? Not that they're going to use that money to solve those problems, but at least they are making the case to not send more money to these neo-fascists in Ukraine. And so, yeah, compare that 70% Chinese millennial homeownership to Canada. 57% of Canadian millennials are already homeowners. And yeah, the figure is higher among those that are older than 35. And so here we have Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We have built our nation's wealth off of the plunder of the third world. We have exploited the indigenous population here. We have exploited their land. We have exploited immigrant workers. We have exploited Burkina Faso. We have exploited Haiti. We have exploited Afghanistan. And we, as a country in Canada, have become very wealthy from that record of exploitation. The remarkable thing about China is that China does not go around starting wars. It does not fund neo-Nazis. And it doesn't exploit the resources of other countries by coercive force. It signs trade agreements with African countries to build ports, which is sometimes framed as a form of imperialist aggression. And it also forgives a lot of African debt, third world debt more broadly, because China understands that it has an interest in mutual development with the rest of the third world. And the third world recognizes the importance that China plays in a leadership role through the BRICS coalition and wants to get on board with China, the fastest growing economy in the world, which is solely at odds, or which is at odds with the U.S. Unipolar hegemony. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. It has the fastest rate of technological development in the world. It is the fastest growing economy in the world. China is clearly the future, and the whole world is slowly starting to recognize that. We in Canada, and much of the Trotskyist Cornel West tendency on the left, needs to figure this out and needs to realize this quickly. Because the world is changing quickly, and the longer it takes us to make this adaptation and really push for these changes here at home, the worse it's going to be in making the transition from where we're at to where we need to be and where the rest of the world is headed. So that's all I have for today. Thanks a lot, everyone. And yeah, this is Red Pen. Red pens are red pen is an instrument of criticism, but it's also an instrument of education, and that's sort of the inspiration that I have behind the red pen. Okay, thanks everyone. Take care. Happy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you in the next one.